and the persons who have passed through the organization. The entity thus has its own personality, which is derived from the instincts, native abilities, timing, perseverance, loyalty, and hard work of its co-workers and founders. We believe it is important for the people here today to understand where we're coming from. Especially in this year's 70th anniversary, we can look back and reflect on the past to see why we've been a successful company. The Shiely Company from the beginning had a corporate mission. That mission is clear in 1914 as it is today, revolved around people. We are here today because our forebears were entrepreneurs, willing to take risks, and those of us here today follow with personal loyalty and active participation. We are gaining experience, knowledge, skill, and wisdom to perpetuate the enterprise and offer a challenge to the future generations. We've made a complete search of the corporate archives, minute books, personal recollections of the old-timers, payroll records were reviewed to make this presentation. Every attempt was made to include those who made significant contributions, and we humbly apologize if we've omitted or made errors. Generally, the people slides reflect the year the person volunteered to help the enterprise. It is assumed that all persons here know what happened in the last 10 years. Thus, because of necessity, we cut off with 1974. This presentation was produced by Nancy Slustro, JL Shiely Jr., with professional assistance from Associated Images of Minneapolis. Others making contributions included Diane Minnick, Sandy Ron, and Donna Peterson. We now give you the Shiely Roots 70 years.
This is going to take an hour and a half. Another opening, another show. This company is a human institution, people, with initiative to make it work. For the last 43 of its 70 years existence, it has grown at the compound rate of more than 10% per year. Growth required superior performance from all. Today we reflect on the outstanding people who founded, nurtured, and contributed their lives, skills, perseverance, and loyalty to make the enterprise go.
Michael Shiely was born in 1822 in County Clare, Ireland. He immigrated to the United States during the potato famine. He settled in Faxon Township, Sibley County, near Belle Plaine, Minnesota in 1851. He was a farmer, a teamster or freighter. He ran a ferry at Saxon on the Minnesota River and was a member of the Minnesota legislature in 1876. James Shiely was born in Sibley County in 1860 to Michael and Mary Eustace Shiely. James married Ellen Morrison in 1883 in Faxon Township and founded a general heavy hauling teaming contracting business in St. Paul. James Shiely hauled the cut stone from rail sidings to the state capitol and cathedral, as well as many other projects in St. Paul. Joseph L. Shiely was born in St. Paul in 1885 to James and Ellen Shiely. He attended Mechanic Arts High School and worked summer vacations for Butler Brothers of St. Paul, who are contractors on such projects as the Northern Pacific Shops, which is the new Bandana Square, the Public Library, and the Minnesota Club. In 1901, Joe worked for Butler Brothers on the Iron Range and was fired 2 years later by John Butler. In 1903, Joe joined Newman and Hoy, who were railroad contractors of St. Paul, where he was a clerk, a timekeeper, a job foreman on various projects in Minnesota, North Dakota, and Montana. In 1908, he worked for the Northern Pacific Railroad on double tracking from Garrison to Missoula, Montana. In 1909, Joe was hired by Harvey F. Hamilton, a resident engineer for the Great Northern Railroad at Minot, North Dakota. Later, he was based at Great Falls and Helena, Montana, reporting to a C.O. Jenks, who was the superintendent of the Montana Division at Great Falls. He represented the railroad supervising contractors building depots, a very large number of bridges at Hanford, North Dakota, 2 tunnels at Basin, Montana, and a double tracking from Summit to Java, which is now Nimrod in Montana. In 1913, General Superintendent C.O. Jenks sent Joe to Devil's Lake, North Dakota as a roadmaster, a position he later disliked, preferring to stay on at the Montana Division. He resigned with the intention of founding his own business. Mary Jenny and Joe Shiely were married in St. Paul on May 15, 1913. Grant Smith, a contractor who had been supervised by Joe on the Great Northern work, introduced Joe to one C.C. Blackie Smith, a dirt mover with S.J. Groves and Sons. Groves was building the Dan Patch Line, which is later the Minnesota Northfield and Southern, now a subsidiary of the Sioux Line. In 1914, H.J. Farrell joined the company. He was elected secretary and director in 1919, served as office manager, purchasing agent, and credit manager, and is still active with the company 70 years later. Mr. Farrell, please tell us what it was like when you joined the company.
Well, when I joined the company actually was 1914, and people that are reached my age now have friends that are contemplating remarriage. I know one fellow was going to get married again, and he told his lady friend, he promised his lady friend he'd be true, but his teeth would be false. Going back to 1913, that was when the income tax law went into effect. In 1914, the workmen's compensation took effect. Now I have to digress a little bit and go back to the year 1916. 1916, I believe it or not, I was on the wrong side of the tracks, but I went to the school with a young man named F. Scott Fitzgerald. That might ring a bell. He was an author, and his first book was This Side of Paradise. He wrote the book while he lived in a brownstone apartment building just east of Dale Street on Summit Avenue. I have very good notes here.
Take your time.
Yeah, I didn't check this, so made a big class. Well, Scott Fitzgerald, I was with him in school, but it was not the school we're thinking of. It was a confirmation class, and we were getting ready for making our confirmation. This is 1916. So the confirmation was made. It was in the downtown cathedral in St. Paul. That's why I want to tell you where that was located. The downtown cathedral had the entire block of Walmashaw Street facing Dayton, 7th Street on one side, 6th on the other, and St. Peter on the other. One corner of this wonderful big building, downtown cathedral, had the Christian Brothers First School. Now that building was in the process of being, the new cathedral would be built, so they were going to tear this down. 1915 and 16, they tore down this beautiful downtown cathedral and started the steel work, the structural steel, to put up a big building, really 10-story building, I think. And one corner was going to be the Capitol Theater, a very beautiful theater. And the rest of the building was going to be some big department store and all the building combined. Sherman Mannheim was headed. But they very foolishly added 2 stories to the plan, so their financing that came from some Jewish people in Chicago was canceled. There the building stood, the structural steel stood, all during the war until the year 1918. Finkelstein and Rubin had the theater, so they got no financing. And the financing came from Billy Ham of the Ham Brewery Company. And that building was started then in 1918, and you'll see it now, beautifully finished. And it's an office building, and the Capitol Theater is one corner. The building is known as the Ham Building. That shows you where the downtown cathedral was anyway. Around that time, I got a job with a young man. We were kind of cooperating. Both had about the same kind of work. And his name was Shipstead. The Shipsteads later on started a great show. Most of you know about it. Shipstead and Johnson's Ice Party. You've seen the show, I'm sure of that. I can't read my notes, so I can't go very good. The next thing I was supposed to meet, 10 days before this, or maybe 2 weeks, I met JL Shiely downtown. He offered me the job as an accountant for his office, and I accepted. He said, March 1st, meet me at my apartment. There were 2 new apartment buildings on the corner, out St. Peter and Summit Avenue. Well, I got there promptly at March 1st, and it was a cold day, and they were starting the excavating for the 3rd apartment building, which Mr. Shiely had the contract for. And he asked me to hold the marking tape. I tried to hold the marking tape in my hands. It went right out of my fingers. My fingers took too cold. So I tried it again, and that happened again. So they got somebody else to take the marking tape instead of the measurement. Now, excavating in those days was just a number 2 hand-point shovel. You dug it. Put it in a 2-yard dump truck. There was no mechanics at all, no steam shovel, no mechanical work at all. After about half an hour of that, JL Shiely and I went in to see his bride, who had been keeping the books, Mary Jenny Shiely. Very, very capable one. She had been the business manager and the office manager for a large coal company, Harton Coal Company. So she knew how to start the book. She explained the books to me for about a half an hour, and then we started back to our office. Oh boy, our office. Mr. Shiely had an automobile. It was called a brush. It was nothing but a wagon in the back, and the seat. We were out in the rain or snow, and the driver's wheel was straight up and down. Shiely parked this at the top of St. Peter Street Hill, cold weather. So we got on, he gave it a push, and away we went. After we got halfway down, he threw it in the gear, and I guess the car started. Well, we got up to our office, St. Anthony and Louis, and my office was a very plain wooden building, flat roof, probably size of about the office, maybe it was 10 feet by 14. Back to this, immediately back to this, was the blacksmith shop. Now, my duties were to be the accountant, the stenographer, the sitting desk man, the buyer when I had to buy horseshoes, fronts long, shorts and hinds. That's the way to describe these shoes. It depended upon how the long caulk was for winter. And the invented one up in Duluth, the diamond caulk company, where they screwed the caulk in for winter driving. Anyway, I had to go out when the blacksmith got hot iron. I had to go out. He held the card while I spun the sleds. I don't weigh about as much as the sled. We started to cut the bars and so forth. Now we come into what would be the payrolls in this type of the year. The payrolls don't drop dead. 10 cents an hour for the working man. Was a 60-hour week. The married man got $6. He had to pay 5 cents car fare to get to work, 5 cents car fare to go home. He netted 90 cents per day. For a full week, he'd be getting less than $6. Now the Teamsters were skilled. They got 17.5 cents an hour. But they had to come early at work, curricle the horse, and be downtown at 7 before the piece started. As I remember, most of our work was excavating work. It was just put on your hands and shovel it into the 2-yard dump trucks. And we had no sand pit. We had to scrounge for sand. We had a contract for the city of St. Paul, furnishing the sand for 1 mile of paving from Rice Street to Dale Street. 1 mile. And we got most of that sand from the corners of Park Avenue and Combe. Both sides of the corner. One of them is the doctor's office. The other side is the boiler room for the Bethesda Hospital. But we really excavated the sand out of there. And incidentally, University Avenue was a business street, but it wasn't very well built up. So there was a lot of high lots along in there. People had built houses on the regular graded lots, but they didn't go for the high lot. So we took it off with a step scraper, remove the topsoil, and we would dig that sand and bring it out for the paving job. But I still feel sorry for these, not only the working men at their 10 cents an hour, but particularly feel sorry for the Teamsters. some of our teamsters, we had contracts for hauling coal for two big coal companies. The Carnegie Coal Company and the Hannah Coal Company. And if they had a coal spill in the wintertime, they'd call the teamsters out. They'd be having their Christmas dinner, or they'd be having a New Year's dinner, or family gathering. They had to go and haul coal to the St. Paul Hotel and other big buildings at straight time, 7 days and a half, 6 hours, straight time. There was no such thing as overtime at anything at all. When I think about that, you might not cry about it, but many a time in bed I cry and say prayers for these men. Pretty sad stuff. I don't want to give you too much sad stuff or you go home crying yourself. 3, 4, 7. 7, 5, 6. I guess it would be 65. Just plain I told her how it was serving. There were no mechanics, nothing else, and we had only just scroungs of sand at different places. Actually, before we got any sand at all, it was the year 1915. On Dale Street, there was a firm named Fitch and Hill. S.K. Fitch was a sales manager sales for the Armor Company of South St. Paul. He was on Broadway Street, St. Paul. But he had a mechanical genius named Fitch, and he put together a screening plant, and I think we sold most of his material for the year 15 and the beginning of 16, and of course in 1917 we built our old plant on Dale Street, just alongside of the S.K. Fitch plant. Now I'd like to have you fellas go home and cry in your beer when I tell you about these wages, 10 cents an hour, 17.5 cents an hour. So it reminded me of two Irishmen that got a little high, not too high, but feeling pretty good. Once the Pat, how long since he went to confession? Oh, he said, I don't know. Let's see, 4, maybe 5 years. When did you go? Oh, he said, I haven't been for 4 or 5 years. I'll tell you what I'll do. Right up we go. So I started across the street, got in the church, and they drove into the confessional. Pat was on one side, Mike was on the other. So Pat thought he saw the shadow. The priest was in there, he looked through the grate, and he started off, sorry for his sins, and he went on with his little litany. And all of a sudden, as he looked closer, the priest was not there. And he looked through the grates, and who did he see on the other side of the other grate? Was Mike. Mike, where did the priest go? So I'll tell you, Pat, if half the things we've been telling are true, he's gone for a policeman.
Smith and Shiely, a partnership, went into the sand and gravel business in St. Paul. Smith furnished $1,000 cash, 14 horses, the blankets and the wagons. Joe's father, James, loaned him $1,000 to match Smith's cash. Within 2 years, the partnership had paid for all of the horses, wagons, and blankets, and Smith proposed that Shiely buy his half interest for $10,000. Shiely bought out Smith, and the Shiely Company was born. In 1914, Fred Aline J. Jenny joined the company as a builder and a millwright. He was also the father-in-law of Joe Shiely. He started building the aggregate plants at the Dale Street in 1917. He worked with the company until his retirement in the 1930s. Lacking the working capital, Joe appealed for help from Daniel L. Bell, who was a wealthy building material executive operating a business along the river at Jackson Street in St. Paul. Bell furnished the funds for the company through 1915. In 1915, Alfred O. Curly Nelson joined the company. Curly worked on almost every project with the company until his retirement in 1957. He was the longtime superintendent at the Second Snelling plant. Bell suggested a corporation, and that Joe approach a wealthy lumberman of Milwaukee by the name of Ray Meehan for additional corporate funds. On April 8, 1916, JL Shiely, Daniel Bell, and Ray Meehan formed the JL Shiely Company, a Minnesota corporation. Bell owned 2 shares worth $200. Mr. Shiely owned 83 shares worth $8,300, and Ray Meehan owned 83 shares worth $8,300. At that time, the company worth was 168 shares worth $16,800. The new corporation completed construction of the Dale Street processing plant in 1916, the present site of the City of St. Paul Public Works Department. In 1917, Albert R. Shiely graduated from law school from the University of Minnesota. He became the vice president and director of the company in 1919, and executive vice president of the company in 1950, and was then made president of the company in 1958. He was a longtime confidant of his brother Joe. He retired from the company in 1964. In 1918, with World War I and the company practically bankrupt, Ray Meehan decided to sell his interest to Bell. Bell then was the controlling person in the corporation. Mr. Shiely owned 83 shares and Dan Bell owed 85. 1919 proved to be a moderately profitable year, but the Dale Street deposit was depleting. In 1920, Joe negotiated a lease royalty agreement with the Great Northern for operating the first Snelling Avenue plant along the now Pierce Butler Road, which is east and west of Snelling Avenue. A new processing plant was built and business was excellent. In 1921, Daniel L. Bell acquired St. Paul Crushed Stone Company on West 7th Street, which was in St. Paul, from the Robbins Estates in Minneapolis, and gave Joe a half interest in the business if he would manage it. It balanced sand sales using crushed Platteville limestone for coarse aggregate in concrete. In 1921, Eric W. Alm joined the company as the bookkeeper. He was elected the treasurer in 1944 and became a board member of the company in 1945. He retired in 1964. In 1921, Carl Larson joined the company. He started as the superintendent at the West 7th Street plant when the operation was first acquired. He worked on almost every project with the company and was a longtime superintendent at the Mendota plant. He retired in 1957. In 1921, the Shiely Company was organized as follows. There were 4 directors: Joe Shiely Sr., Daniel Bell, Albert R. Shiely, and H.J. Farrell. Joe Shiely was also the president of the company. The vice president of operations was Albert Shiely, the secretary was Mr. Farrell, and the treasurer was Daniel Bell. There were 2 superintendents because there were 2 plants. The first Snelling plant was Curly Nelson, and the West 7th plant was supervised by Carl Larson. And that's the way the company was in 1921.
By 1923, ASTM and the National Bureau of Standards had established specifications for aggregate that would provide for the economical use of Portland cement and concrete. Joe negotiated a lease royalty agreement with the Canadian National Railway and the Northern Pacific Railway and commenced building the second Snelling aggregate plant on the site of our present office at 1101 North Snelling Avenue. This operation continued until 1954. Benny Zarbinsky joined the company in that era. He was a crane shovel operator at all plants, and he retired in 1970. In 1924, the company was awarded a contract by the Great Northern Railroad to build and operate 8 ballast-producing plants, washed gravel. These plants ceased operating about 1932. Also in 1924, James Moke Halleck joined the company as a teamster at West 7th Street. He was a superintendent at Minot, North Dakota later, and Mendota, and Larson plant. He retired as a loader operator in 1970. Frontline J. Jenny hired George E. Ed Stein out west. Ed was probably the most effective of the field personnel in his time. He worked as a superintendent everywhere, especially where problems existed. He was a superintendent at St. Cloud until his untimely death in 1953. In 1925, Lyman Garland, who had worked everywhere with the company, replaced Ed Stein. He joined the company, and he replaced Ed Stein as superintendent at St. Cloud in 1953. Lyman retired in January of 1969. Lyman, we want to hear what you have to say about working for the company and about the lifestyle and the various locations you worked.
I started out at Brookston, Minnesota, early in the spring of 1929, and they were building a washing plant there. When that plant was completed, I had a chance to go to Nimrod and help build another plant. And we worked there that summer, and about Labor Day, we were finished at Nimrod, and then we were sent to over near Minot, North Dakota, at a place called Brindley. And we worked there until, and also at the same time they were building one at New London. And we worked on these two jobs until it got too cold, and they sent us to Wenatchee, Washington. And we built a plant at Wenatchee, Washington, and when that was completed, I and a few other then went back to Glacier Park. And we worked there until that fall. And at that time, one of the worst depressions this country ever went through was setting in, and there was no work. So in 1931, work was pretty near non-existent. And so I didn't work in 1931 at all. And then in 1932, the company operated a plant at Brookston for the summer long, and I worked there. JL Jr. worked there too. And then the next year, the depression was still on, and there was no work. Well, in early 1934, Shiely's got the contract to produce the gravel for Fort Dam. First, they got a contract to produce some ballast, and then before we had that contract filled, we got a contract to furnish wash sand and gravel, and then later on they got a contract for what they call tow gravel. So I worked there in 34, 35, and 36. And when we got through out there, they sent another man and I over to a place in the Little Rocky Mountains called Sortland. The company had a mining engineer out there. He was sort of evaluating a certain mine. And we went out there and we built a mess hall and a bunkhouse. And then I came back to Minnesota. And for the next 3 years or so, I worked at the Sterling Avenue plant in the wintertime, kind of repairing. And a lot of the timber was getting bad and had to be changed. And about 3 or 4 men worked there, about 3 different winters. And then they bought a gold mine out at a place called Hughes Creek. It's about 100 miles southwest of Missoula, Montana. And they sent Tom Brown and myself out there to help out. We went over into Idaho and dismantled the gold barge and hauled it back to Montana and set it up. Well, we worked there until it froze up to a river, froze us out. Well, Joe worked there that summer, and Bob Shiely worked there part of the time that summer too. Well, then I came back to Minnesota. Later on in the winter, the war scare was kind of coming on, and they were building up the armaments. I went down to Burlington, Iowa, and worked on a shell loading plant for about a number of months. When we got through there, I came back to Minnesota, and hadn't been here very long till Curly Nelson wrote me a letter. He said if I wanted to, they could use me come down, they could use me at New Brighton. They were setting up a ready-mix plant. So I went down to New Brighton, and we finished that job. Then we went over, we did a little work on the Sterling Avenue ready-mix plant too. And then they decided to build a rock crushing plant at Mendota. And we worked there that winter and all the following summer. And during this time, the war was on, and and I was drafted. They were drafting men at that time from 18 to 35. I lacked about 2 months to be 35. So, but not long after that, they come up with a regulation that said that anybody that was over 35 and had a job that was essential to the war effort would be released. So I wrote to Shiely's and told them about it, and I got a letter saying that come back home, and I had a job at Rosemont. Well, when I got back home, though, Rosemont had been canceled out. And they said, we're going to Hanford instead. So 4 or 5 of us got together, and we sold 2 cars of us, went out there. And we got to Pasco, Washington, and Joe Shiely met us there and took us over and got us through DuPont's personnel offices. You had to have a badge, you couldn't get on the property. You had to have a birth certificate to work there, too. We didn't know what we were making, but anyway, Joe took us out to the job site, and we worked there. I worked there 16 months. We set up 2 washing plants and about 3 ready-mix plants. At that time, Shiely's were in with some contractor, some other sanding valve producers from out west. We had to pool their equipment because it was impossible to buy anything in those days. You had to use just what you had. Well, anyhow, I worked there 16 months, and by that time, the St. Cloud job was coming up. Well, I took about 2 weeks vacation and went to St. Cloud. That was in December of 1944. And then I was there until I retired in 69. And you were asking about the camp. We built camps everywhere we went. Bunkhouse and the dining room and the kitchen, sort of a T-shaped building. The kitchen was in the back, the dining room was across the front. And then there's a number of bunkhouses, with probably about 10 or 12 men in each one. But when we got to Hanford, we shook our heads to see the setup they had there. They had the barracks, right, it must have been 40 acres of them. And they were just like the old Army barracks at Fort Snelling, except they were 1 floor. And these barracks are, they had bunks, it was all open here. But these were divided into rooms, 2 men in a room. And when you went in there, Joe took us in one of the mess halls, and you went in and you bought a meal ticket. And as you ate, they put your meal out each time. And I think they were $12 for a week. And that entitled you to a room. When you bought the first ticket, they assigned you a barracks number such and such, and room number so and so. And that's the way it was set up. But the other places, when we built the camps, and they charged us $1 a day board. But the company didn't feed. There was a commissary outfit out of Superior, Wisconsin, did most of it. Northern Commissary Company. But they fed very well. We lived high on the hog. At least I thought it did. I guess that's about sums it up, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you. 1924, James Halleck and Walt Stein. 1929, James Martin Shiely, the Little Major, who directed the ready-mix concrete operations till 1964. Jimmy was active in civic affairs. He was the family patriarch. He always administered to the sick and buried all the dead. He was the founder of the Old Timers Hot Stove League. 1929 saw Roy Scoob, clerk, sales, serviceman, and both aggregate ready-mix concrete. Retired in 1974. In 1929, Guaranteed Concrete Company was founded and began production of ready-mix concrete under James Martin Shiely. I made a note because when we ran through the rehearsal last night, the director who was sitting back there with you indicated that there's a confusion in names. First, you want to write them down so you don't make a mistake. The JL Shiely Company spelled out was the first company. Its subsidiary, called Guaranteed Concrete Company, was in the ready-mix concrete business under Jimmy Shiely. It was always in St. Paul or the St. Paul suburbs. It later became called, later on, Shiely Concrete Company. The confusion runs rampant because at the time in 1963, Landers Nordblum Christensen Company was acquired by the Shiely Company, and they had a company called Ready Mix Concrete Company of Minneapolis. Throughout this text, I'm going to refer to that as Minneapolis Ready Mix. Ultimately, all of the ready-mix concrete companies were consolidated into what we know now as Shiely Concrete Materials. In 1930, with the crash of the stock market, the aggregate and ready-mix concrete market dwindling, during the deep financial depression, Joe Sr. started looking for work for the company and the employees throughout North Dakota, Montana, and Washington, an area he knew well. In '33, after competitive bidding, the company was awarded a contract for several million tons of concrete aggregate for Fort Peck Dam in Montana under the Corps of Engineers. It is interesting to note here that the Cooley Gravel Company of Denver, Colorado was the second bidder. And Cecil Cooley, till they took him out to the cemetery, would say to me every once in a while, you know, I think Joe snookered me out of that job. The source was an extensive deposit 70 miles from the dam site at Cole, Montana. George E. Stein was the superintendent. Later, a subsequent contract for slope protection stone, called toe gravel, was awarded to Shiely and the Hallett interests of Crosby, Minnesota. A new corporation called Becker County Shiely Company was formed. S.T. Samuel T. Harrison joined the company on this contract. The Cole, Montana operations were very profitable, and Shiely became a major factor in the aggregate business. 1933, R.C. Lilly. Daniel L. Bell, the controlling shareholder, believed this type of work booming around the United States was too risky for the Shiely Company. Richard Coyle Lilly, president of the First National Bank of St. Paul, arranged a loan of $100,000 for JL Shiely Sr. to acquire the Bell stock. Thus, the company was worth, apparently, about $200,000. Thus, from that day on, JL Shiely Sr. controlled the company. Bell's interest was terminated. Bell remained the corporate treasurer till the late 30s when he retired. 1934, Earl Mullen, JL Shiely Sr. at Cole, Montana. 1935, we find Bo Holiski, who joined us at West 7th Street, went to Snelling Avenue, to Yard A, crane shovel operator, foreman at Great Cloud. He's one of the four Holiskis who worked with the company. He just retired in 1983. 1939, A.F. Fred Anderson. Never afraid to tackle any job. He was a master mechanic at Cole, Montana, at Bangor, Alabama, and St. Cloud. Retired in 1959. 1936, another Bo Holiski. 1939, Samuel T. Tom Harrison, a mining engineer from Michigan Tech, worked for the Becker County Shiely Company at coal, joined the Shiely full-time in 1939. He was the first safety director. He was a USNR officer in World War I. He was called up in World War II, was a full captain and a four-striper. Returned to the company in 1945. He was the chief engineer until his retirement in 1960. He was in charge of all feasibility, design and construction details for Nelson, Larson, yards A and B, 2 ready-mix concrete plants. Operating personnel and management considered Tom Harrison a real top hand. In the 1934 to 42 era, Lyman talked about the gold mining ventures. They were at Zortman, Montana, Elkhorn, and Hughes Creek, Montana, none of which were even moderately profitable. In 1938, the company was awarded a contract for 600,000 tons, this is again after competitive bidding, of riprap stone for the Sardis Reservoir project in Mississippi. The source was a quarry at Bangor, Alabama. S.T. Tom Harrison was in charge. 1940, George E. Edstein and Curly Nelson. 1940, Gerald Morrison, weighmaster, dispatcher at West 7th Street, in service for 3 years, back to weighmaster, dispatcher at 2nd Snelling, thence to Yard A, retired in 1976. In 1942, one of the corporate characters joined the company, Herman Smokey Belfast. He was an ex-St. Paul fireman. He supervised all truck operations. He had a Teamster's vocabulary, often vulgar, but right to the point. Everyone liked Smokey. He was a great character. He served everyone well until his untimely death in 1961. 1941 to 45, World War II. The Shiely Company participated in war efforts, projects, and was awarded an E for excellence for its contribution. The project included joint ventures. As Lyman explained to you, sometime companies had to pool their equipment to get the job done because you couldn't buy anything new. Shiely joined with A. Guthrie and Company of St. Paul and L. Johnson Construction of Minneapolis at the Iowa Ordnance Plant at Burlington, Iowa. They joined Corning Donahue and C.H. Klein of Minneapolis, producing ready-mix concrete at both New Brighton Arms Plant and Rosemont Ordnance Plant. They joined Hallett Construction and aggregate production at Rosemont, Minnesota, and the United Construction Company of Winona, Smith, Hoffman, and Wright of Portland, Oregon, in the production of the aggregate and ready-mix concrete plants at the DuPont Atomic Energy Project at Hanford, Washington. 1942, JL Shiely. 1942, Fredlin J. Jenny. In 1942, Mendota Plant and Quarry was operated to replace West 7th Street and furnish crushed stone for Rosemont. 1944, Arnold Hintz always supervised the quarry operations at St. Cloud, retired in 1982. 1944, Frank Grushka Sr. supervised plant operations at St. Cloud. In 1944 also, the company, in partnership with Al C. Petter's Company of St. Cloud, was awarded a long-term contract by the Northern Pacific Railroad for production of railroad ballast at St. Cloud. 1945, John Widans joined the company. He was originally at Mendota, then at the truck garage. He was at Yard C as a supervisor. He later was associated in the concrete business. He retired June 1st of 1977. Johnny, tell us about what went on in your early days with the company. And incidentally, John's father's picture was in one of those early pictures of the company along with Zarbinsky.
Well, first, it's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you for this. Roots, as it says on our screen, everything has to have a start. And my first connection was with the JL Shiely Company was my father, of course, George. He operated a crane from 1917 or 1920, I'm not sure, somewhere in that time, till 1942. My personal roots started in 1945. After 3 years in the Army, 7 months of combat in ETO, 7 months in hospitals, I didn't think anything could top that experience, but I was wrong. I started as a mechanic at Mendota Quarry, affectionately called Boomtown. Most everyone started in Boomtown. Evidently it was a proving ground. Carl Larson was a superintendent at the plant, and he always said, if they last 2 weeks, they'll last. They'll stay. Well, on my first day, Carl handed me a roll of wire and said, all you have to do is keep them running. Well, them happened to be 2 Hall Scott trucks, a 1928 vintage. Remember, this is 1945. And 1 AC Mack truck of 1922 vintage. You can imagine what went through my mind about then. Well, these 3 trucks consisted of a fleet that hauled rock from the shovel to the crusher. And it seemed like an unsurmountable task at first glance. But with many rolls of wire and a lot of time and hard work, 2 years passed. The experience and happenings in those 2 years could be a bestseller in most bookstores. Then 1947 came along, and I got a chance to step up the ladder to the Snelling Avenue truck garage. Joe Loretz, an excellent mechanic, and myself took care of the concrete trucks and the ukes that operated at the Snelling plant. This was a step in the right direction. I remember when R.C. Shiely would come into the garage and all the equipment was out working, Joe and I'd be sitting on a bench. Joe would say to Bob, he says, well, when they're all out working, you're making money. I worked here until 1953, when I was asked to take a management job at Yard A. This was a big move for me. New plants, new kind of work, towing operation, and general turmoil. It was an education for me and a real challenge. One of the earlier problems was the crane operators would get seasick while they were unloading the barges, because the barges would bob and they'd watch the barge and the water, and they'd get a little seasick. But they overcame that problem as time went on. It seemed like I took up residence at Yard A for a few years, but as time passed, everything worked out. Now this river operation is one of the best in the country. I spent 15 years establishing my roots in the sand and gravel department at Yard A. Then in 1968, R.C. Shiely asked me to join him in a concrete business in Minneapolis. Unable to say no, I moved to Minneapolis, ready-mix concrete company, and finished the construction of the new plant, and we tried many methods of making concrete there. The most effective was the dryer, which is now commonplace in this area. Concrete can be made at just about any temperature the customer wants. About 2 years later, Ray Devine was transferred to the concrete sales, and I was asked to oversee the concrete production of both cities. This I did until 1977, when I retired. I wish to thank the management of the JL Shiely Company for my opportunity with this great company. Now it is my pleasure to tell you about some of the people that helped to build the foundation for this company. The name's on the screen there. Billy Lemke. He was a plant man at Snelling Avenue, and I can remember him as not too big of a man, but he always wore a black hat. We didn't have hard hats in them days, but his black hat was always on him. And Joe Schoenberger. He was a mechanic originally at Snelling Avenue plant, later became a crane operator, and he always had big overalls on, bib overalls, and his back pockets were full of tools, so you can imagine what he looked like walking around. Shorty Stickland. Shorty Stickland worked at the top of the Snelling Avenue plant, which was a screening plant, and he never needed a bullhorn for anything. Shorty could holler louder than any bullhorn could ever begin. When he let out a yell, you could hear him on Snelling and University without any trouble. There was no problem listening to Shorty Stickland. Floyd Spencer. Floyd Spencer was kind of a yard foreman, as I remember. And I can remember him in the wintertime when there was a lot of stripping done, cleaning off the upper burden of dirt. He would have a great big sheepskin coat on, and it never seemed to have any buttons or anything, but it had great big blanket pins to hold it together. And he never carried a shovel or anything like that. He carried a stick or a staff or a cane. And he would just point that cane or stick to where he wanted the trucks to dump. And that's where he stood all day long, and he'd stand there and have these trucks dump in the right spot. I can remember him real well standing around that big sheepskin coat. Leo Zingerle. This was a super fine man in our Snelling Avenue office. He was a person that would just bend over backwards to do anything to help you. And any kind of a problem you had, he was there to help you with it. Andy Limburg. Andy Limburg was in Boomtown. He was a dynamite man at Boomtown. And in the morning, he had a wheelbarrow, and it had a rubber tire on it. It was pretty good. He would load caps, dynamite, fuses, and whatever else he needed for the day or the morning. He'd load it in the wheelbarrow and take off over the bumps up to where he was going to set the dynamite to blast the rock. When he never got blasted, but he did it. He led it right up to where he wanted to do it. James Holisky Sr. My first impression of James Holisky Sr. was 1945 when I came out of the service. I went out to Mendota and Boomtown to work as a mechanic. And James Sr., he says, let's go down and help the kid. And he would always give you a hand, no matter what you was doing or how hard a work it was or what was going on. James Holisky Sr. would be right there to give you a hand. Jim Oliver. Jim Oliver was a dispatcher for the sand and gravel and the concrete department. He was at Mendota when I first came back out of hospital. I was home for a month, and they wanted him for concrete duty at the Snelling Avenue plant, so they sent me off for a month at Mendota plant or Boomtown to run the scale so they could spring Jim Oliver to get back in the concrete business. Elwood Steinbach. Elwood Steinbach was a crane operator, and I always got to say something good. He was my brother-in-law. That's about it. Rick Perrin. Rick Perrin was a fireman on the shovel in Boomtown. Being a fireman on the shovel in Boomtown is really quite a job. You got to carry the coal, and you got to get it into the machine, and you got to shovel it in there, and you got to clean it out. You get pretty dirty. But Fred used to walk to work from down in Lilydale where he lived, and he carried a lunch. So help me, it would take care of all the people in the plant. And a big lunch. You'd think he had his laundry under his arm when he came to work. But every day he had a great big lunch. Billy DiMatteo. Billy DiMatteo was a perfect little gentleman. He could make the best wine this side of Italy. And he was a real fine person. Paul Kautz. He was a plant man at Snelling Avenue and later loaded trucks down at Yard A. And Paul was getting off the streetcar one day at Snelling Avenue going to work, and as he stepped off the streetcar, he was hit by a car, and it kind of broke up his legs a little bit and his hips and that. So he had a brace on one leg, a steel brace, so that whenever he'd fall down or tip at the Yard A, he'd fall over sometimes, he'd stumble, and he couldn't get up. He had to have help get up, or otherwise he'd kind of crawl up the side of a pile. and maybe get up that way, but mostly you had to have somebody help him get up. But Paul kept right on working. He never had a handicap man. He was there. Emmett Riley was a batchman at the Snelling concrete plant. Where he went to from there, I really don't know. But Emmett Riley was batchman there for a long time. Tom Brown was a timber man, I call him. Now, maybe the other people got different names for these people, but he built bridges for the railroad, and they were all made out of timbers. And of course our plants were made of timbers, and Tom Brown was the man that stood on the end of a timber and took an adze and cleaned it off and fitted it so that it would make the plant. He could hide his, well in fact he did, he hid his tools. Whenever he got done doing a job or a day, he didn't bother to take the tools back to the shop or a toolbox. He stashed them, we called it. He'd put them under a rock or behind something. But then he might be wanted a week later, and he'd tell one of us, he'd say, well, go and get such and such a tool, and it's over behind such and such a place. And it was there. He knew exactly where he had put them all, but they were spread all over the plant. Chris Larson was a North Dakota operation, as was Harry Shearer. He was a North Dakota operation. We get to Cliff Spencer. Cliff Spencer was the son of Floyd Spencer, and he was a dozer operator, and he was known as High Blade. When you operate a dozer around the plants, we'd always have holes in the roads and dips, so the trucks make holes, and we'd think that a person driving around with a dozer would drop the blade and fill the holes up. But no, Cliff Spencer was known as High Blade. We kept the holes, so there was never anything worried about that. We just went on over them. Charlie Oliski. There's another Oliski, and he's a concrete warehouse man, I called him, because he was the one that unloaded the cement. He unloaded the sack cement out of the railroad cars. If somebody came and wanted a sack of cement or anything out of the concrete warehouse, Charlie Oliski was the man that would drop it down off of the platform to you. And always with a smile and with something to say, a wisecrack of some kind. Jess Cox. Jess Cox was a gentleman farmer, I think you'd call him, because he had a little farm, and then he worked at us at Boomtown as a crusher feeder. Jimmy Oliski. Jimmy Oliski, of course, the son of James Oliski, was a truck driver for our company from the time I can remember. And he had from Yard A to the concrete plant, he had a groove in the pavement. I'm sure the truck just followed the way down there because he went back and forth all day long for years to come. Jim was a very, very fine person. There was no truck driving to do it. Jimmy'd help you do anything that had to be done. Fred Hetto. Fred Hetto was at the field hopper on Snelling Avenue. We used to have a field hopper on one side of the railroad tracks and a conveyor belt going across the railroad tracks over to the plant. And Fred Hetto was the one that took care of that field hopper. Jim Finley. Jim Finley was, I call him kind of a boomtown foreman. He'd work around there and do things. But Jim was one of them guys, I don't think he could eat his lunch without putting his gloves on. He did everything, he'd have to put on the gloves first, no matter what it was. Clem Bird. There isn't too much to say about Clem Bird. He was always in trouble, no matter what. If it wasn't at work, it was away from work. Clem had lots of problems. Joe Mann. Well, Joe Mann and his wife lived in a house that was on Boomtown property, adjacent to our scale office and they they lived there and kind of looked after the place on off hours and so forth. But Joe he'd help down in the crusher where they were feeding the rock into the crusher so it could beat up. He'd work down in there, and at noon he'd generally go back up to his house and have lunch. But Joe had a little problem. He only had one eye, and he had a glass eye. And the glass eye would get turned around in his head. And it would get probably point to heaven and maybe to hell. And it would get full of dust. And I'll tell you, you didn't tell him, and most of the time we didn't tell him about it. He would go up home, and his wife, he'd come in the house, And you never heard such screaming and hollering in your life. She'd take the broom to him and drive him out of there until he got that eye straightened out and cleaned out. She had a beam for that one. And Joe was also so bow-legged that if he had straightened up, I'm sure he'd been at 4 inches to his height. But a wonderful guy. Charlie Chatterton. He was a teamster at Snelling Avenue. He had 2 horses that he used around the plant there. He had a scraper and so forth that he cleaned up around the plant and under the hoppers. Charles Durrell. He worked at all plants out west and could do anything expected of him. And I thank you very much for the opportunity of being here, and I thank the Shiely Company for giving me my opportunity to have roots.
Thank you, John. 1945, Joe Westendorf, office manager at St. Cloud until his retirement in 1976. Joe married quite well shortly after that. 1945, Raymond J. Devine. Ray had no real formal education other than he had jungle cunning and understood Portland cement concrete. He had worked on placing concrete before he came to the Shiely Company. And in 1945, he took over both the technical and the plant operations for Guaranteed Concrete under James Martin Shiely. Ray was extremely well liked by the customers, the testing laboratories. They all respected his judgment in technical matters. Unfortunately, Ray died in September of 1978. Now, it's interesting to note something about Ray. We had a difficult time finding pictures of Ray, and it was because the simple explanation was that Ray was always the one who took all the pictures at all the different places. He was a photographer. Robert C. Shiely. He was an Air Force B-24 pilot, son of Albert, worked in trucking and in concrete, ultimately to become president of Landers Nordblom Christensen Company and Minneapolis Ready Mix Concrete Company. He left the Shiely Company in 1973 to become president of Ready Mix Concrete Company of Denver. Bob now lives in Denver and runs a consulting firm. 1945, Frank H. Guggins. Frank was from down in the Winona, Minnesota area. He was a self-starter. He joined the JL Shiely Company in World War II. He worked on the rebuilding of all the plants in 1945. All of the plants had to be retrieved from such places as Hanford, Washington. In 1949, he took over the Green, North Dakota operation. Subsequent to that, under Tom Harrison, Frank supervised all the construction in connection with Nelson Larson, yards A, B, and C, 2 concrete plants. He put the towboat and barge operation together. In 1969, the board of directors elected Frank Guggins vice president of operations. Frank retired in June of 1974. 1946, Jake Workala. Jake was the master mechanic at 2nd Snelling. He relieved Frank Guggins as superintendent at Green, North Dakota. Jake was the victim of a very serious accident at Green, North Dakota. He lost his arm. In 1953, He was superintendent at Nelson plant. He was a very quiet and reserved man, a top troubleshooter for the company. He retired in 1966. In 1946, JL. With the end of World War II and the heavy demand for aggregate and ready-mix concrete in the St. Paul, Minneapolis metro area, it was necessary to retrieve the plants and equipment from the various locations around the country, re-erect and upgrade the facilities, increase production everywhere. That brought us to 1946 with Lawrence G. Oscar. He came as a rock picker at Boomtown for Carl Larson. He was a foreman under James Halleck at Mendota and at Larson. Became superintendent at Larson in 1965. Larry?
Well, in April 23rd, 1946, I came to work at the Mendota plant for 55 cents an hour and approximately $22 a week. Carl Larson was the superintendent, and I was darn glad to get the job. Our business then wasn't too rushing. We crushed about 50 to 75 tons per hour and about 75,000 tons per year. We also were in the wall stone and veneer stone business, which we had approximately 25 to 30 men quarrying stone out of the ledges by hand with crowbars and sledgehammers and rock chisels. The company had its own blacksmith who used to make the rock chisels and crowbars. Also made drill steel for the drill rigs, which were three-wheel wagon drills, and we pushed them around by hand. They were fed air by a compressor that was up in our shop, and the air was piped out to the drills. We also had 4 stone cutters, which cut stone veneer for homes and office buildings, and they cut this stone on piecework. They got so much a ton for the finished material. Our main shovel was an iron wheel Marion steam shovel, which is seen in the pictures, which is fired by coal and operated by steam. This machine had an operator, a fireman, and also an oiler who carried the coal up to the fireman and kept the water lines hooked up and seen to it the shovel didn't run out of water. Our hauling trucks were the old Hull Scots that Johnny talked about, and the one chain drive Mack truck, which had hard rubber tires. This was quite a truck. The only cab was a seat and the cab shield from the box. This truck hauled about 8 yards of material. These trucks didn't have windows or heaters in them, and in the cold winter days, the drivers used to put a can in the cab with fuel oil in a burlap sack and light it to warm their hands. Also, they sometimes used alcohol, I think, other than heating. Later on, about 1948, 49, we got into the dinky locomotive to haul the rock to the crusher. We had to lay railroad ties and rails out to the pit. This track run approximately 2,500 to 3,000 feet out into the pit, from the crushing plant to the shovel. We had to move this track in alongside the blasted rock. Most of the work was done by men with crowbars and muscle. If a dinky or a rail car would run off the track, we would have to lift them back on with a block and gin poles. Each dinky pulled 4 rail cars, which held about 4.5 tons. Our delivery trucks back in 1946 were loaded by a 3-wheel Jeffrey electric bucket loader. This was some machine. If it broke down, then we had to load the trucks by hand. The plant consisted of a 20-inch McCulloch crusher, that was our primary crusher, and an 8-inch Newhouse crusher. And we had 2 2-foot Simon cone crushers, 2 5x10 Tyler screens, and 1 5x12 Jude Robbins screen, and 1 big full screen that separated the rock. The plant was constructed of wood and timber and planks. In about 1952, we purchased a light new Bucyrus Series 25 1-yard steam shovel. This had tracks on it. Boy, this was ever a dandy shovel. It too operated by steam, boiler, and coal. This had a horizontal boiler where the old Marion had a vertical boiler. We also got a Barber Green gas-operated loader with buckets on it, and also a Hayes loader with buckets on it. These machines were really something after operating the old Jeffrey 3-wheel bucket loaders. In about 1955, we really made a change in our hauling units. We took three 1927 gas Euclids and trailers and made them into side dump haulers. They hauled about 14 tons. We had three of them, and we also went to the first bucket end loader. We tried Schuylkill Bills, 1-yard machines, also had TL10s, TL11s, and TL12 Alice Chalmer loaders. I remember one loader we were demonstrating, it was a 3-yard Peterborough malt corn. Al Shiely came out to see it and he asked what we were doing. We told him we'd like to buy this machine. He asked us how much it cost, and the price was about $13,500. He said, send it back. Where in the hell will we get this kind of money? My, how things have changed today. In 1953, I became a pit foreman under the supervision of Jim Hallett. I worked in charge of the Wallstone crew, and you really had to work hard, because if you didn't, you got fired. There was always people waiting to come to work for Shiely's. The company had a great reputation and a good business going. Their checks were always good, and always had a good chance to get promoted to a better job, like a plan man, a loader operator, a driller, or even a dynamite man. These were all better jobs and paid a little more money. Then picking out Wallstone and flagstone. Then in 1956, we got a P&H diesel shovel. I believe this was a 1.5 yard shovel. We used this machine until the quarter was completed in 1958, and we moved to the Larson plant and went into operation there in 1959. In summary, I'd like to touch on a few of the people who worked very hard to make the company go. Carl Larson, a great superintendent and a serious man. Walt Stein, a super shovel operator and loader operator, and was also very willing to help and teach you things about the operation. James Hallett, a very hard worker and a dedicated company man. Also was like a father to me. I was very fond of James Hallett. Tom Harrison, a very smart apple and a top-notch engineer, and also a very good man in the safety program. Frank Guggens and Jake Worklow, both very dedicated workers. Also worked many years with both Frank and Jake. I helped Frank when he laid out the Mendota plan. We put in our first underground water system. Helped him and Tom Harrison lay in the tracks for the dinkies. Worked with Jake when he came back from North Dakota, and Jake was a very, very dedicated man. He worked with his bad arm, and he got hurt up in the Dakotas, and was very, very dedicated. And also many laborers and operators and people who had good goings and tough goings with the company. And in turn, all made good living. So as I look back over the years, I'd like to salute Mr. Joe Shiely Sr. and his continuing family and say thank you for buying the first team of horses. It's been a good life. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry Oster. Nancy showed you the chart, the first chart. And now the board of directors has grown in 1946 to Albert Shiely and Alm and James Martin, Farrell, JL, and myself. JL Shiely was the president, Farrell was the secretary, vice president in charge of operations was Albert, the treasurer was E.W. Alm. St. Cloud was S.T. Harrison and George E. Ed Stein. Second Snelling Avenue was Alfred O. Nelson. Mendota Quarry was Carl Larson. James Martin Shiely ran Guaranteed Concrete Company. The trucking was handled by R.C. Shiely and Smokey Belfus. Operations were Raymond J. Devine. And that's the way we were in 1946. 1946, James Andrews and his wife Lillian Valancourt Andrews, who joined us in 1966. Jim was the trusted, meticulous, energetic worker. He directed the personnel department and the labor relations. Lil worked in the office. Jim married Lil. Jim retired in 1980. At the same time, in 1947, Lawrence Steiner, who brought Jim Farrell here today, long-time capable employee. We were thankful to have him. He directed the accounts payable, paying all the bills out in Greene, North Dakota, and all the different places, until his retirement in 1981. 1947 saw Jack Quirk and his wife Alberta in the picture. Jack worked at Boomtown Nelson plant, everyone's friend. 47 saw Donald Brown. Don Brown originally worked for Curly at 2nd Snelling Avenue, then went down to Yard A. Loyal, ambitious, a good man. 1949, the one and only Kenneth Flom, Greene, North Dakota, the ham radio operator, the powerhouse engineer at Greene, assistant superintendent at Greene, thence to the concrete companies, and finally superintendent at Nelson plant in 1966.
You just about told my story, Joe. I think I've got a few on you. On May 10th, 1949, I just happened to cross the valley down there between Greene and Grano, which the plants are named after, and there were two semi-trailers. I don't think they were new either. They were hauled in there and dumped alongside the road, and I wondered, what the heck's going on here? So I walks in, and they're loaded with iron and tools and everything you need to build a plant. I got in there, and up in the front end was Frank Guggens, and I don't remember who the bookkeeper was at that time, but they were up there with a plank across the end. That was their office. So I got across all the iron and got up to the front end and asked them if they had a job for me. And Frank says, yeah, sure, what's your social security number? I said, you first, Frank, I've got no social security number. So I went off, got my social security number, come back, and the next day, why, the bookkeeper says, hey, we don't need you. Frank heard this in the background. He said, we need all the doggone help we can get out here. So we went to work. And every day out there on that construction was just a circus that I'd never seen before. There was people coming and going and things happening that I didn't even think I was ever going to understand. I'm not too sure yet. But I know Joe Jr. was tearing his hair out, I think. He didn't want to admit it, but Frank was driving back and forth to Mohall where he lived with Bertha, and I don't think he slept any time. At one time out there, I think there was up to 110 people working. This started in May of 1949. They started building this plant, digging holes, pouring concrete, setting steel. All this stuff went on. Tom Harrison was out there. I didn't really get to know Tom too well, so one time he wasn't happy with something I was doing. I'll tell you a little later on down the road. But this thing was just a madhouse from one end to the other. There was bare ground out there, or buckbrush is all there was. They leveled it to get in there to go to work, start building. A railroad had to be built 4 miles in, about 4 miles into this location. All the, everything had to be brought in. And as they went along, the plant did kind of take shape. And I kind of started to understand what they were doing. And this was a plan to make 6-inch, 3-inch, 1.5 and 3/4 gravel for the Garrison Dam, which was to be shipped by rail. The plant started running in August. It was a Sunday morning in August. Frank told me, he says, why don't you come down and you can watch? I thought, boy, that's great. Frank's gonna let me come down here and watch him start up on a Sunday morning. I didn't realize what Frank was up to at the time. He needed help, I could tell right away. Because we got the rocks about section B, the first section, and there seemed to be a problem there. And the same way in section C, this plant was built originally. This wasn't a new plant, this was one they had bought from Utah Sand and Gravel and brought in here and put up. But this plant was designed to take 1.5-inch rock, and they were putting 6-inch rock through it. Well, it wasn't going through. So we spent quite a bit of time. The watching was over real quick. We done a little modifying the rest of the summer. All nights. 3 months we worked without a day off, and I got sick one day. And my mother-in-law's place was just a half a mile from this plant. My wife and I were living in a trailer. And Frank come up here to see how come I didn't come to work. As you that have worked for Frank know that he really expects you to be there on time and all that. So, but the plant did run, got started, and I really think even today's standards, the 3 months, whatever it was, that they put this thing together from nothing, from constructing a power plant. They produced their own power. The power lines, everything was put up. It was automated too, for you engineers. It had an automated system. If you saw it, all the wires run from every motor in the plant into one little control shack, just like a spider web. But it was automated. It was pretty good. We had a problem one morning. They had an engineer, pretty professional fellow, I guess, that operated a power plant, and what do you know, one morning he didn't show up. And if any of you remember how Frank got a little nervous at times, he went around there, it was kind of bothering people. But he come over to me, and I guess some way or another he learned that during the war I was a chief engineer on an Australian towboat. And that's the truth. I was the only engineer on that towboat. But he says, do you suppose you and I could get that thing running? We went down there, and you know, after a while, there was 600 pounds of air for starting. We bled that down a couple of times before we figured out how to open the throttle. But we got it running, got it online, and right away I had a good job. Frank says, you just stay here and watch this thing. Which we did for about a year or so. And then I guess the company about that time was thinking, I think, pretty strongly about the Nelson plant and the towboat operation. So Frank went back into St. Paul to work on that. And Jake came out there and was superintendent. And right away, Jake screwed up my life. He took me out of the powerhouse where I was retired and made me go back to work. He made me foreman out there. But that wasn't all bad either. So that plant, when it was running like it should, was producing about 500 ton an hour of rock. We wasted everything below 2-inch minus, went into the waste pile right off the section B, and the rest was about 500 ton of rock, which was 6-inch and 3-inch and 1.5 and 3/4. These were being all loaded on railroad cars, and during the course of that operation, we loaded a total of about 28,000 railroad cars out of there. At times, we were loading as high as 110 cars a day. 3 trains were running in and out of there, 3 switches a day to do that. The railroad, the Sioux line, was burning out engines, pulling them out of the valley there too many at a time, so they finally learned how to do that. But it was exciting. There wasn't a day went by that the inspectors, I don't think we have bad inspectors now. Those inspectors inspected every rock, I think. I'm not kidding you. They carried more pails of rock around there, and I know Frank and Jake and everybody was in there trying to switch those tunnels around, get one of those gates open that would run the right gradation. But it went on. We were loading at 3 loading pipples. And I understand that that was a very profitable operation up there. I didn't know anything about it at that time, but I've heard over the years that it really didn't hurt this company too much. Because I was up there in the winter times, and they kept sending the bankers up to check to see if the stockpiles were there, to check and see if the parts were in the trailers we said we had were there. And I couldn't figure it out. About 2 or 3 times a winter, they come back see if those stockpiles had moved yet. And at that time, they were evidently borrowing money. The plant was operating good, producing good revenue, and made possible the upcoming Nelson plant, towing operation, barges, towboats, concrete plant, yard aid. So I feel kind of honored that I was involved in what I think, and I think a lot of the people believe was a very important time for this company. Big advancements. Things went ahead real fast, I think, after that. The operation ended, the plant operation ended in 1956. 57, we started tearing the plant apart. And right away, Frank was in trouble down here in Great Cloud. I thought he was in trouble. He asked me to come down. Pretty soon he insisted I come down. This country kid, you know, I don't know, St. Paul, Minneapolis, that's big time. You only order stuff from Ward's and Sears out of there. So we finally came down. Frank says, come down and try it for 3 months. Well, 27 years later, it's the longest 3 months I've ever put in. It's been a long day. It's been good. Where are we at now? Well, in 1959, I came down and stayed with Frank down there, and later worked with Jake. Both of who taught me many, many things. Jake, I know, taught me how to make a bearing that was worn out, run another couple of days. Then heal up overnight for him. I don't know how he did it, but it worked. I just couldn't believe it ever happened. And I remember Jake, with a little Buick, would drive by I'd be over in the plant there, he'd drive by and say, hey, he had air conditioning in that Buick, and that was kind of nice at that time. He'd roll the window down about 2 inches. He says, I got to go up the park machine. So he did. But we learned a lot of things from those fellas, and a lot of other ones. In 1959, Bob Shiely was in charge of concrete. And he came down to Nelson plant one day, and he got me out in the car out there, and he said, wouldn't you like to go to the concrete plant? Well, sure. What the heck? It's an advancement. It's a good look at the world and see what's going on. So in 59, we went up there, and right away they sent me off to school. I think they sent something. But they said they wanted to let me find out what slump was. And I didn't know. But we found out. We went down to the University of Maryland, I think it was, and we graduated. And we spent about two years up there, and this was during the construction of the airport terminal. The folded plate, hyperbolic, paraboloid, and all that kind of stuff, you know. And we worked up there. They were running the concrete plant at Mendota and the one on Childs Road. And it seemed to me most of the time they were sending me out to, the air wasn't quite right on this load or that load. Go out and do something for it. So that's what we did. We learned our way around St. Paul, Minneapolis fairly well in those times. And we went back to Nelson plant after that concrete deal. Worked with Jake down there until the time when he retired. And we've been there ever since as the plant manager. And it's been pretty good. And I'd like to thank JL Jr., Tom Harrison, Frank Boomans, Jake Wardilla, Ray Devine, and there's just a lot more people that I just can't mention all of them. Even Johnny Woodends. There's a lot of people. Lyman Garland helped me a lot. He helped me keep that 20-inch pressure going that Larry talked about to come out of Mendota. There's been a lot of good people. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. with a script. Last night I got in trouble and I missed, and the director sitting back there will get on me if I don't watch out what I'm doing here. 1949, in February of 49, the company was awarded a contract for all the course aggregate for Garrison Dam in North Dakota. Now that's after competitive bidding. In fact, we beat the hell of people out of that job. The source was on the Upper Souris Migratory Wildfowl Refuge at Green, North Dakota. My father was sitting in on a chair down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on a patio, and when we called him and told him we were low at Garrison, he fell right out of the chair. We built 4 miles of railroad that Kenny talks about. The 28,000 carloads moved over that track to the dam site, which was down about another 70, 80 miles. The last shipment was in August of '56. This was a very profitable venture, and the cash flow formed the basis for the financing of the Nelson plant, Yard A, concrete plant, barges, towboats, etc., and trucks, concrete trucks. In '49 also, Paul Beinhorn joined the Shiely Company from the Trap Rock Company at Dresser, Wisconsin. Paul was later elected vice president for sales of aggregate. He was a civil engineer, formerly with the Portland Cement Association and the Bureau of Reclamation. He was awarded the Croix de Guerre in World War I in connection with some balloon observations. Always a gentleman, he was a prime factor in the success of the Shiely Company. He retired in 1963 in ill health. Lowry Smith took over that particular job in 1964 from Paul Beinhorn. 1949, Robert Woodhouse, real good worker and an excellent piano player. Every time we had a company party, Bob played the piano. In 1950, Al Grills. Well, everybody knows Al Grills, our trucking superintendent. Also in 1950, you have left to right, Joe Dixon, Frank Coogan's, Sam Taylor, who later took over as the office manager, Walt Eklund at Green, North Dakota. Never could understand how Sam could have a 2 handicap in golf, and he worked up in North Dakota in all that buckbrush. In 1950, with the dwindling reserves, after 26 years a second Snelling plant, the company entered into a long-term lease of 2,200 acres of land underlain with sand and gravel on Gray Cloud Island, 15 miles downstream from St. Paul. The land had been thoroughly prospected over the prior 10 years. So by 1950, we've grown. We've got 8 directors. JL Shiely Sr. is still the president. Albert Shiely's executive VP. I'm in charge of operations. H.J. Farrell is the secretary. The chief engineer is Tom Harrison. The way we were organized in those days, I didn't have anything to do with St. Cloud. That was personally handled by Tom Harrison and George E. Stein. Derek W. Alm was the treasurer. Green, North Dakota was Frank Coogan's. Second Snelling was Alfred O. Nelson. Mendota was Carl Larson. Guaranteed Concrete was still James Martin Shiely. The trucking was Bob Shiely and Smokey Belfast. The operations, Ray Devine. And that's the way we were in 1950. 1951, Tom Harrison and President McNamara of the Sioux Line. Paul Beinhorn. In 1951, after competitive bidding, the company was awarded another contract in North Dakota for filter rock for the slope protection at Garrison Dam. The source was at Minot. Portable equipment was used to complete the contract. Jim Halleck was the superintendent. 1953, Carol LaBoyle. Carol worked for Frank Hugans on the Nelson plant construction. Later joined the ready mix operations, and now is superintendent for yards A, B, and C. Carol, who did you work with, and who do you remember in the early days at the Shiely Company?
Well, in 1953, Joe, I was building a house for the neighbor, old Bill Whitman, who happened to be the father of Pat Ganaway's present farmer that does all the tree planting for us, Bill Whitman Jr. When this green Chev pulled on the job, and that was my first contact with the JL Shiely Company. It was Frank Hugans. And he was looking for a building permit. And I happened to be on the town board at the time, and life was much more simple then. Ray, you'll be interested in this, there wasn't even a building permit required. And I don't know, they built houses in those days, no building permits, they're all standing, and it makes you wonder if all the rigmarole we go through today is just to support the bureaucracy.
Those Democrats again.
So they started construction, and I went to work for the Hagstrom Construction Company. And they poured all the footings for the present Nelson plant. And Frank was on the job, and he was checking all the formwork before he let him pour any concrete. And I was working with a young, of course I was pretty young then myself, you know, that's a long time ago. Carpenter from Hastings, Bob Pryormuth, and Kenny, your section where the sand screws are. We had laid out form and all the bolt settings, we had all these supported from the top, and we were pretty proud of it. We said, Frank, it's ready to pour. And so he comes over with his tape and he checked everything all the time. And I'll never forget, he says, well, now how about is it square? And I looked at Bob and he looked at me and I thought, God, we're in trouble now. But you know, he checked it, and amazingly, we were within a 16th of an inch on all those bolt settings. Well, we got done with the pouring all the footings down there, and Frank was going on vacation, and he came to Bob and I, and he says, you know, I'm going on vacation for a couple of weeks, but I'd like to have you two fellows come back and work for me. He says, we'll be erecting steel, and we'll have to put the catwalks on. So Bob and I both came back, and we worked the balance of that summer at Nelson. That winter, we went up to Nelson, and that was the first time I ever met Curly Nelson. I looked at him the first time, I thought, my God, I didn't know they made men that big. And we helped disassemble part of that, and a lot of those pieces from Nelson went down to, or from Snelling went down to Nelson. In the spring, we were involved in putting those pieces from Snelling into the Nelson plant. And I got ready to run. And again, he asked Bob and I if we wanted to stay and work for him. Of course, it was quite a cut in salary. We were going from carpenter to labor. And I'll never forget, whenever there was a problem, you know, Frank would have the whole crew, and he'd be in the middle fixing it. He'd have everybody around him, though. And I remember when they loaded the first barge, there was men on the barge like ants, and nobody really knew what the hell was going on. They couldn't figure out how to hook it up to that pulling cable. Well, then they brought the Beeler brothers down, and God, it was real simple. They took a log chain, they put a kind of, what do you call that, a log wrap around the cable and onto the timber head. It was simple. And that was the first time I ever met the Beelers. Well, for one reason or other, I left the company in '54, but I came back in '56. Worked in the concrete company. We started as a batsman, and I worked at that for about a year, and by that end of the year, I was talking to myself. But that was my first experience meeting James Martin Shiely. And you know, really, I've never met anybody like him before or since. They literally threw the mold away, Joe, after they made James Martin. I don't think he bought his clothes from Hubert White. He wasn't really cared how he dressed. Matter of fact, half of the time, I think his fly was open. He always had a pipe in his mouth. Sometimes he was kind of drooling from the pipe even. But he had probably the sharpest memory of any man I've ever known. He could sit and tell stories and reminisce on things like when your father was married, Joe. He would tell you in minute detail everything about that wedding. And Dan is a Balkan when your grandfather was the carnival.
Oh, yes.
He told about the time they stole the Balkans fire engine. He was also a great baseball fan. As a matter of fact, every winter he'd go to Florida for the spring baseball. And he was a great booster of St. Paul. Matter of fact, the baseball stadium they tore down, that was almost a monument to Jim Shiely. And when they built a new one out here, you know, he swore he'd never go in it. Matter of fact, he made bets with people that he would never go in that baseball stadium. He got them all hats. But you know, his urge to go see baseball finally overcame him. And you know, here he had all these bets. So one day he come around and he says, "Say," he says, "you haven't got an old hat, have you?" And he went all them in and he collected all these old hats. He paid off all his bets so he could go watch baseball again. Never forget James Martin. And then there was Smokey Belfast. And you know, I never really realized his real name was Herman. But if Smokey was in the area, you knew it because you heard him. And if you ever asked him for anything, you know, there was a lot of turmoil. But about a half hour later, he'd be back and he'd done whatever you asked him. He had a heart of gold. And he always used to carry a wad of bills around that would choke a horse. And he always tried to be so tough, but he was really a soft touch to anybody, particularly the driver's wives. When they were hard up for money, they came to see Smokey, and he took care of them. And then there was Raymond J. Devine. And I worked for Ray. And I was dispatched concrete there for 6 years. And Ray knew concrete. I remember one day they were pouring the terminal at the airport here, and they had too many voids in the columns. And I can still hear him talking about B sub-zero design for me. You know, he literally redesigned the mix on the job, called the plant, do this, do that. You know, before the next column, no more voids. He knew concrete. He went forwards and backwards. Well, you know, I was there, and thank God, here comes Frank one day. And I sure owe Frank a lot of things. He rescued me out of the concrete division. I got to go to Yard C, and that was in about 1963. We were down in the coal dock. But I never quite got completely away from concrete, because then I ran into Ed Saugestead. And there was another institution. You know, if you've seen that, he had a station wagon. If you saw that come down the hill from the ready-mix plant, you knew you were out of gradation. Right now. We had some characters over there. See, I kind of got the, the ones Johnny didn't want at Yard A and Yard B. We got Jerry Shaikowski on the crane. Jerry was an excellent crane operator. Wasn't always too reliable. He'd come to work with a white shirt, and he'd go home and that white shirt would be clean. We got Al Borlicky running the Bobcat. Till one day he was running the Bobcat, he broke both his ankles. because he didn't have a seatbelt fastened. So then Al was gone, and then we got Clint Runstead. He was running the Bobcat, and we used to go along the wall and we pull the electric cable from the train, and he backed off the wall into the river. I said, my God, Clint, didn't you have your seatbelt fastened? He said, no, if I did, I would have drowned. But then about 64, we started building New Yard, see. In fact, they got the roads graded, and there's those steep things that are still there. In the fall, John Pola's brother Charlie came and paved the hill down to the bottom. Ended up in a blizzard, remember, Joe? Ended up throwing plastic over and a bunch of straw. Never looked at it again until spring. Of course, in spring, that was the 65 flood. And God, I never saw water like that in my life coming down through that upper St. Anthony lock, you know. The turbulence was as high as from the ceiling to the floor here. And we hadn't backfilled the wall, and we were supposed to put rock in such a certain way that just to save it, we pushed everything that was there in so it wouldn't get washed out on us. I was over at sea for about 6 years until John went to concrete plants. And then I got transferred over to Yard 8. And I can still remember John telling me now, he says, you're going to Yard 8, he says, you're going to have smoke. He says, no, you got to be careful. He says, smoke give you a bad time. I went to Yard 8, you know, I was actually kind of afraid of him because, Jesus, he'd been around a long time. And he had quite a reputation. Larry probably knows that much better than I do. But for some strange reason, Broke and I got along very well. He never called me Carol. It was Get, hey, Get. And he always had a lot of good suggestions, and they were very helpful to me. And he, one day he came to me, and you know, he had 49 years with the company yet. And I really believe he was aiming to serve 50 years. One day he came and says, say, Kid, he says, I gotta go to the doctor tomorrow. And Jim never came back to work. He became ill, and he's deceased now. But that's kind of the way it was, Joe. It's been quite an experience.
In 1953, for the first time, the company could consider entering into long-term financial planning and financing. The net worth of the company at the time was about $1.5 million, and it appeared in the initial investigation made by Harrison and others that to put in Nelson, the towboat, the barges, the concrete plant, concrete trucks, and the other appurtenances that were needed would require about $3.5 million. This was $2 million more than we could ever borrow from a bank. Using the pledge of the cash flow from the Green, North Dakota operations, Bert A. Turner of the Coleman Company arranged for a consortium of financial institutions, which included Bankers Life Insurance Company of Lincoln, Nebraska, Modern Woodmen of the World Insurance Company of Rock Island, Illinois, and the First National Bank of St. Paul, to furnish the working capital and the capital funds to completely overhaul the company. It was congenital at that time that depreciation and cash flow through the 30s, when a lot of the facilities were built, would not have produced enough dollars to rebuild them new. In 1953, Bert Turner put together the financial packages that revitalized the company, and he became a member of the board of directors. At that time, JL Shiely Sr., Albert Shiely, James Martin Shiely, and H.J. Farrell were all at retirement age, but still were willing to pledge their estates and their homes to accomplish this project. Richard Carl Lilly, Bert A. Turner, and William Oppenheimer then joined the corporate board. 1953, William Oppenheimer, counsel to the corporation, later a director, retired in 1966. I am going to run through a series of names here of individuals who were key to making the Nelson towboat, barges, all of the work undertaken in 1954 relatively slow, because the director told me I went through them too fast last night. But we owe a debt of gratitude to these men. Leroy Mike Beeler, Adolph Hankin, Jerry Zarvinsky, Pat Ganaway, Al Sandkamp, Bob Beeler, Robert Burchett. On April 1st of 1954, the Nelson plant on Lower Great Cloud Island commenced operation. The sale of the bonds were accomplished. These included indentures and trusts, charter party agreements, bank loans, all arranged by Turner. We acquired 12 barges, a towboat, Yard A, concrete plant 2 on Childs Road. New concrete trucks were all included in the financing. Although the aggregate was transported by barge at a number of locations in the U.S. of A., like Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New Orleans, St. Louis, Cincinnati, all over the place, the bondholders and the bankers considered our operation to be a very risky business venture. Second Snelling Avenue plant shut down. In 1955, the company commenced buying acreage underlain with dolomitic limestone on Upper Great Cloud Island. The Mendota Quarry was phased out and converted into a river distribution, Yard B. In 1958, Bert Turner arranged a second financing package, and the Larson plant was built and commenced operation on Upper Great Cloud Island. 6 additional barges were acquired. Yard B became operative, and another concrete plant, number 3, was erected at Mendota. In 1959, Arita Betts joined our company. She was the administrative assistant to Don Rio and myself. She retired in 1974. The same year, Donald C. Rio, formerly with the Internal Revenue Service and Title Insurance Company of Minnesota, became our controller, later vice president, treasurer, and finally president. Don, what do you got to say?
Thank you, Joe. Well, it was a cold, blustery Saturday morning in March 1959 that I met Jake Workula down at Rice Cafe in St. Paul Park. It was about 15 below with a lot of wind. Jake took me to a tour of the Nelson plant and the Yard A. We wanted to do it on a Saturday morning because there were no employees around, and I guess we didn't want to raise any questions at that time. The following days, Frank Rubens and I toured the Larson plant under construction at the time. He and I went to the top on catwalks, all 7 stories without handrails, and me wearing street shoes. Frank had a way of testing your grit. I recognized it right away. Ray Devine took me on several jobs where we were delivering concrete. With his magic rebound hammer and liquid detergent bottle, he showed me how to meet concrete specs. John Withers took me to Yard A and explained the various products and customers. I worked directly under the direction of Eric Allen, a great personality, hard taskmaster, but a splendid teacher. With the help and patience of people like Frank, John, Ray, and Jake, I eventually learned something about the aggregate business. That's the way we were in 1959. We had Larson plant, Nelson plant, Yard A, Hoy, and the Charles Road concrete plant. We employed about 75 people at 4 locations. We had one woman in the organization, Rita Betts, who very aptly handled the switchboard, typing, and other office duties. The company and many of its employees had just returned from work in North Dakota and were in the process of establishing itself in a new deposit at Great Cloud with the touring distribution yard. We were growing quite fast, these new endeavors. However, probably the greatest notable catastrophic event of the 60s was the Great Flood of 65. It put the company out of business for 2 months in the summer, caused considerable financial loss. However, the personnel of the company distinguished themselves by working night and day, furnishing materials for dikes and sandbags. We received commendation letters from the governor, city of St. Paul, mayors, and mayor of Minneapolis, and the commissioners of Washington County. Liberty Mutual Insurance Company awarded life-saving medals to several of our employees. In the 1960s, we became computerized with G. Lamb as the first computer operator. Percy Curious was our first programmer. Later, Rita Kuzner Erickson and Joan Cashman joined the company and added to our capabilities. Many of the office duties at that time were handled expertly by Donna Peterson. In the 60s, we went through an acquisition period. We acquired Landers Nordblom Christian Company of Minneapolis, Corning Donahue Ready Mix, Allied Ready Mix, Standard Ready Mix, half of the interest in Sheely Petter's company in St. Cloud, and in 1970, the Cooley Gravel Company of Denver. This confluence of people into one working unit was accomplished with few problems. It's to our credit of our people that this was so. Our people and the acquired companies personally gained from the experiences of each other. We are now a well-organized, I feel, people-oriented company. We underwent major personnel organizational changes due to retirements in the years 64 and 74. The one common denominator that I found among the employees was and is the loyalty, hard work, doing things smart, and fulfilling the social needs and commitments of the community. We now operate at 14 locations. We employ about 450 people. Through the years, we have survived several serious economic recessions, major floods and fires. We now survive as a stronger company. Joe, has been a long and hard road from Cole, Montana to the Snelling Avenue and the streets of Warrenton, Colorado.
Thank you, Don. In 1960, Clarence G. Frame, president of the First National Bank of St. Paul, joined our company as a director. 1961 marked the entry of the JL Shiely Company into the Minneapolis aggregate market, using the city of Minneapolis coal dock that Carol was talking about under the old Washington Avenue Bridge. Towing operations were overtaxed and some contract towing was hired. 62, Gene Lamb, first computer operator, came with us, retired in 1976. In In 1963, with the aid of the First National Bank of St. Paul, C.G. Frame, and others, we were able to negotiate the termination of the financial packages arranged by Burke Turner in 1953 and 58. Restricting covenants in these indentures and charter party agreements made it difficult for corporate growth. These indentures and charter party agreements were replaced by simple banknotes, and we were out of the financing by life insurance companies. In that July of 1963, the company acquired 100% of the stock of Landers Nordblum Christensen Company of Minneapolis. This was a big company. It was a big financial investment for the Shiely Company. They had aggregate and ready-mix concrete besides being in the building material business, and Robert C. Shiely was sent over to become president of Landers Nordblum Christensen. The four names here are Glenn Bateman, Ed Saugestad, Art Egan, and Mike Kuznier. All of these gentlemen have since deceased, but they were valuable people to us in integrating Minneapolis Ready Mix, Landers, the old industrial iron, all the different companies that we were involved in at this time in 1963. Landers owned building material businesses, which we later sold to Wonder Klein of Minneapolis. They had a sand and gravel deposit up at Osseo. We sold that to Barton. They had the mineral filler plant at Savage, which was retained. They had a 50% interest in Old Industrial Aggregate Company, which was up at Broadway and Northeast K in Minneapolis, which is the site now of the warehouses of Dayton Company and that Hilton Hotel up there. The other 50% was owned by the Klein estate, and Charlie Klein had just died, and his nephew, George Klein, was administering that estate. They agreed to liquidate the Industrial Aggregate Company, which is up on Northeast K up there, and Broadway, which was what was, because there were no reserves there, and that you might just as well liquidate the company and get all the cash and all the real estate out of it. The 50% interest in Minneapolis Ready Mix was a gold institution, so we kept that. There were other real estate holdings which were later sold. I have mentioned to Mr. Rio at various times that for reasons only he could understand, it seemed that by the time we got the Landers Nordblum Christensen thing absorbed, we got the plant of Savage for nothing because of sale of real estate and other interests that were in that corporation. So 1963, we've got a group of people who are valued employees of the Shiely Company, loyal, hardworking, that came with this transaction. Kenny Jensen, Harold Fairbanks, Sid Reed, Arnold Samuelson, Percy Perius came at the same time to be the computer programmer. In 1964, Bob Shiely had moved out of our concrete operations, the old Guaranteed Concrete Company, and James Francis Shiely had been with Weyerhaeuser and with the Went Lumber Sales in Minneapolis. He joined us to be head of Guaranteed Concrete Company in St. Paul. Unfortunately, he was only with us 5 years. He died in the spring of 1969. In 1964, Alfred O. Nelson and Joe Jr. I might say that Joe Sr. at the monument out by the office at Snelling Avenue, now known as Big Buster. 1964, Lowry J. Smith took Paul Beinhorn's place, Vice President of Marketing, President of Minnesota Frac Sand Company, and a Director of the Shiely Company. Well, now 1964, we've got 10 directors, and I'm the president, and Carol is the secretary. Lowry J. Smith down there, Frank Coogan's Vice President of Operations. Bob Shiely then is over in Minneapolis with the LNC and Minneapolis Ready Mix. Guaranteed Concrete is James F. Shiely with Ray Devine. VP Treasurer is D.C. Rio. The office manager is J.P. Crane. Credit is Glenn Beathan that came from Landers. St. Cloud is Lyman Garland. Nelson Ken Flom. Larson Larry Osher. The distribution yards are John Williams and Carol O'Boyle. And the bargain towing, Bob Beeler. And that's the way we were in 1964.
Pretty good looking.
1965, John Paula was hired on as a laborer during the flood. He's the president of Shiely Concrete Materials Company today. 1965, Daniel M. Shiely, out of service, worked at Nelson Larson, assistant to Lowry Smith in aggregate sales, now vice president, Shiely Concrete Materials Company. 1965, the Klein estate agreed with Shiely. These two parties, being the owners of Ready Mix Concrete Company in Minneapolis, acquired the riverside land at 10th Avenue South in Minneapolis, erected a new modern Ready Mix Concrete plant. Shiely built the yard facilities and the dock, to be known later as Yard C. This construction was accomplished during the Great Flood of April of 1965. By this time, Guaranteed Concrete Company over at St. Paul had acquired all the ready-mix concrete operations of Corning Donahue and integrated them, the Corning operations, into the Shiely operations. At that time, Jerome P. Crane, CPA, controller, joined the company. He's now our corporate treasurer. 65, Joel Shiely III. During the summers, worked, graduated from engineering school, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Korea, came back to the Shiely Company, was elected Vice President of Operations. He's now Executive Vice President of the Shiely Company. 66, David C. Donnelly joined us as a director. 66, John Ewan. John had been with us in 1953 to 62, and of course you know him as our purchasing agent. 1966, Dennis Kilmer came to Larson plant. He's our manager down at the Mineral Filler plant today. The company in that year also acquired the White Bear ready-mix concrete facilities of Standard Building Material of South St. Paul. For varying reasons, Guaranteed Concrete Company name was phased out and Shiely Concrete Company was born. 67, the towboat Mary Jenny was christened in May. By this time, the company had 30 barges and 2 towboats moving over 45 miles of the Mississippi River. Concurrent with that, Fred Valenti came and is our credit manager. 68, the one and only John Knudsen, a graduate of Michigan School of Mines up in northern Michigan, was the manager at St. Cloud from 68 to 77, spent a year at Morrison, Colorado, and back to St. Cloud, and now is Denver Vice President in charge of operations. 68, Vincent R. Shiely, who at that time was president of Briggs & Stratton, Milwaukee, joined us as a director. Vince died an untimely death in 1977. 69, also in December, Al.C. Petters agreed to sell Shiely the half interest that we didn't own in Shiely Petters Crushed Stone Company, and a new corporation was founded. It's called Shiely Company Incorporated, St. Cloud Division. 1969, Ed Murphy joined us as a director. Richard G. Donovan. And in 1970, Greg Oster came into the Larson plant and finally was made our safety director. In 1970, on January 5th, the Shiely Company acquired Cooley Gravel Company of Denver, Colorado. This was a major undertaking. Between 1970 and 73, 3 Cooley operations ceased for the lack of reserves. A crash program was undertaken to replace this production with a new granite quarry at Morrison, Colorado, and the major overhaul of the Littleton plant. We then got involved with some very important people today, and I'm just going to read their names off because they're all Cooley people. James B. Cooley, Robert Quist, manager at Morrison, Al Quist, manager at Littleton, Bill Timmons, manager at Thornton. In 1970, Joan Cashman joined us. She's always been in charge of aggregate building until she just retired in 1983. 71, Mike McCormick had a part-time summer job fencing Nelson plant, wound up being a salesperson for aggregate at St. Cloud, assistant plant manager at Nelson, and is now in concrete sales. 1971, Donna Cass Peterson. Donna was over with Ready Mix in Minneapolis. She's now with us, Don and I, as our administrative assistant at the home office. In 1972, with the BN merger, an unprecedented demand for ballast was placed on St. Cloud. A very large aggregate processing plant was acquired at the Libby Dam in Montana and moved to St. Cloud. New quarry equipment and other appurtenances were also installed. 1973, Rita Erickson, our data entry manager. 1973, Frank Grushka Jr. 1974, JL Shiely Company acquired the 50% Klein Estate holding in Minneapolis Ready Mix. At that point, Guaranteed Concrete, the old company, Shiely Concrete, all the different concrete companies were merged into one operating entity with a central dispatch system, personnel, purchasing, everything. This we now know as Shiely Concrete Materials Company. Wow, our board of directors, this thing's getting kind of old, don't you think? Our board of directors are now 12, and Joe Jr. is the CEO, and Rio has taken over as presidency, and H.J. Farrell's still secretary. It's significant to note that Shiely Concrete and the Minneapolis Ready Mix outfit, there was nobody in there as an officer simply because Bob Shiely had left the fall before. Cooley, of course, was James B. Cooley and Bob Quist and Joe Quist, and at Littleton was Ryberg. Jim Andrews was the personnel manager. The marketing was Larry Smith. Operations were Joe Shiely III, and he had St. Cloud, John Knudsen, and Pat Ganaway. Nelson was Flom, Larson Oster, Mineral Filler, Arnold Samuelson. The distribution manager was Carl O'Boyle, and the margin towing was Robert Beeler. Counting, of course, Jerry Crane. This is the way we were in 1974.
In 1978, William J. Hickey, who was the president of the Smythe Company, joined our board of directors. Also in 1978, Bob Haugen, who's the president of the Webb Company, joined our board of directors. In 1980, on July 17th, in Colorado Springs, our board of directors approved the management recommendation after 15 months of study to go into the industrial sand business, which is now known as Minnesota Frac Sand. In October, the company purchased all the assets of Bertram St. Paul Ready Mix Company, and in 1982, we formed the Shiely Concrete Materials Company. We started this company in Minnesota in 1914, and for the last 70 years, we've expanded into several different states, which we've discussed. We have also now returned to the state of Minnesota. In 1984, as you can see from this chart, which is more confusing than all of the previous charts that we've looked at, we now have 12 board of directors. We have 6 inside directors and we have 6 outside directors. The chairman of the board is JL Shiely Jr. The corporate secretary, since for the past 70 years, has been Mr. Farrell. The president is Don Real. We now have a corporate affairs department and environmental affairs, and vice president of administration is Ray Lapagard. Executive Vice President is Joe Shiely III. There's now a corporate services department that's made up of engineering and safety with Greg Oster as our safety director and Dave Stark and Mark Bilski as our engineers. The accounting department and our accounting treasurer is Jerry Crane. Controller is John Fortin. Cooley Gravel, we have as president Jim Cooley. John Knudsen is the vice president of operations, and Dick Gordon is vice president of sales. At Morrison, we have Bob Quist, Littleton, Al Quist, and at Thornton, Bill Timmons. Shiely Concrete Materials Company has as its president John Palda, with Dan Shiely as the vice president of sales. The concrete plants are supervised by Al Sandkamp and trucking by Al Grills. Minnesota Frac Sand Company has as its president Lowry Smith and its operations manager Don Bry. Shiely Aggregate Division now has a new vice president and general manager, which is Peter Dunning. Vice president of operations is Pat Ganaway. Tom Curley is our sales manager. St. Cloud superintendent is Frank Bruska Jr. Nelson is Kenny Flom. Larson is Larry Oster. Our distribution yards are supervised by Carol O'Boyle. Savage is supervised by Dennis Kilmer, and towing by Adolph Henkin. As you'll recall from the very first flow chart that we saw, the company was worth $16,800 back in 1921. In 1984, the company is now worth $16,800,000. And that's the way it is in 1984. Consists of nearly 450 employees. These are men and women who take a special pride in their work many of whom are second and third generation employees. Their contributions to our company have been many and are continuing. 1984 is a very special year because we're celebrating the 70th anniversary of our company. As we have reviewed these slides, we hope that one thing has become very clear to you. When we look at the company history, we are looking at the employees, all of the people who have been and who are now Shiely. So today we celebrate and honor 70 years of very special people, and we look forward to future generations of valuable employees. And Joe, it is a long way from Cole, Montana, and we are all very proud to be a part of it with you. Thank you.
I might add this, that I want to give that girl a special hand, because when this thing was mentioned in the first part of December by Mr. Rio, Nancy, I think, kind of volunteered to help. Well, she spent 2 months on this presentation, and I think she's done a hell of a job. And the professionals who are in your audience with the earphones on, I want them to be acknowledged too. So give everyone a big hand, please.
I gotta talk to these people. How's my girlfriend? You guys are great. I know. I see who's back here. I'm gonna get to these two too.
Hi, nice to see you too.
You guys did a great job of that. Thanks a lot. Where's your other buddies?
Oh, that was just great. Congratulations. Great job. Yeah, really.
Well, now you know all about it.
Very well done, Dad. Well, congratulations. Well done. Yes.